Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Identity Radicals. I'm Mike Towers, Chief Security and Trust Officer at Veza. And today I'm thrilled and excited to be joined by Nicole Perlroth, who's the author and acclaimed cybersecurity journalist. Nicole's tracked some state sponsored hacking campaigns, has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and as a New York Times bestseller, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. I love that title. She advises government agencies, startups, venture capital investors as well. Nicole, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for having me.
This is awesome. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Um, yeah, your book reads like a thriller, but reveals some pretty frightening realities about the digital vulnerabilities. I'm wondering if we can start a little bit, Nicole, by exploring some evolution and scale. Why don't we start off? Like, what surprised you the most during your investigation to the zero-day market?
So, I decided to focus on the zero-day market because to me, it was just so absurd to me that, I for my little perch at the New York Times for more than 10 years, I was parachuting into these attacks left and right, some multiple times a day, disparate corners of the world. And there just didn't seem to be quite the urgency I thought necessary to address what was really becoming a national security threat. It was clear to me that as we were plugging software into every nook and cranny of the universe, as Mark Andreessen put it, letting software eat world,
Yep.
um, cybersecurity was becoming national security. To protect our pipelines, to protect our grid from an attack, we needed to think about digital security. And at the same time, I would also learn about the fact that we were trading on our digital security in so many ways. Um, Individuals, including myself, just didn't want to think about it. Cybersecurity can be super annoying. It causes friction. In a lot of cases, businesses would rather spend a dollar on a new product or feature than a dollar on cybersecurity. But what really kind of stopped me was the fact that in government, in many cases, we were paying hackers to hand over digital vulnerabilities, 0 days that no one knew about, not so that we could go make sure that they got patched as quickly as possible, but so that we could use them for our own espionage and battlefield planning advantages. And I am not so naive as to say we should go out there and immediately patch every vulnerability. But increasingly, this was treated as a secret, and it was for a very long time. But increasingly, the cat was out of the bag. And we were even seeing in some cases the NSA's own stockpile of 0 days get hacked by someone we still don't know who they are, called the shadow brokers, and dribbled out all over the internet and picked up by Russia and North Korea and cyber criminals. So to me, I really wanted to tell the story of digital vulnerability in a way that was going to bring people in. I wanted people to understand the sort of cyber dilemma that we are in and also the moral hazard in some cases. I don't know why, but really just the morality of this issue I thought was super interesting and one that people deserve to at least know about. That, our own cybersecurity was being traded in the name of espionage and surveillance in a lot of cases. And I wanted to do it in a way that was written like a spy thriller that would bring people in, to this super technical topic, really, but in a way that had humans really at the front of the story so that people could see this as really what I think it is at the end of the day, which is really a story about humans and how safe we are. Um, so I don't know if I answered your question, but that's why I ended up focusing on the 0 day market. I think what surprised me was the fact that so many people in the market were having second thoughts about what we were doing and the way we were doing business. And the fact that in too many cases, hackers would sell a 0 day and really have no idea what happened to it. And that was starting to keep them up at night. And, here were so many people that had second thoughts about this market, but no one was calling it out because, as I say in the book, the first rule of the zero-day market is like Fight Club. No one
Yeah,
talks about the zero-day market.
yeah. No, it's really, really interesting. It just makes me reflect a little bit on, I mean, your point about being a moral issue and obviously being so deeply embedded across every part of our personal lives, our work lives, everywhere in between. It's hard to imagine anything not being somewhat driven by software or technology. And to your point, therefore, in scope or at least at risk from these attacks. And I remember, it's funny that you talk about the spy thriller thing, and I spent a long time in the life sciences and pharmaceutical industry, and I remember in the '90s and 2000s, every villain or just about every villain in every movie or every book was a pharmaceutical executive, and now it's tech because of this issue. Um, but and also to the point about businesses need data, digital, and technology to compete. It used to
Mhm.
be that the business folks would call on some sort of quote unquote central IT function to drive the technology. But now technology is so deeply embedded and frankly needed for all parts of the business that everybody's becoming a technologist. So it's just definitely becoming much more widespread, much more deeply embedded, and obviously much more potentially impactful. I love the way in the book that you describe the U.S. government as the world's dominant hoarder of 0 days. And you mentioned, how do you think this accumulation is impacting the global security market?
Well, I don't know if it's true anymore. I think it was true when I wrote the book a couple years ago, and it definitely was true, I think, up until Stuxnet. But I think Stuxnet was a pivotal moment, maybe the first pivotal moment where other governments could see very clearly the battlefield value of a 0 day that could get you into a nuclear plant or nuclear enrichment plant. And so these other governments, have been in this market too. And, maybe we're not the biggest hoarder of 0 days. Maybe we're now the biggest developer of 0 days. And these other countries are the biggest hoarder of the ones that they're buying off the market. I don't know where things have sort of settled over the last 3 years, but the landscape, the threat landscape, the attack surface is so much more complicated now,
Yeah,
especially with AI and the potential for very severe vulnerabilities to cause a cascading incident is so serious now. Our digital dependencies are so high now that it really, I almost don't want to think about the fact that anyone is hoarding
yeah,
these 0 days anymore, because there's no way that they're the only one that's going to know about it for very long.
yeah. It's a great point, and I appreciate you sharing about that shift because that's something that I've seen as well, and it also makes me reflect a little bit on my enterprise experience and been doing this long enough that I remember so much of the cybersecurity focus was on protecting data, protecting the confidentiality of data, making sure that the secret sauce didn't end up in the wrong hands, et cetera. But now with technology becoming so deeply embedded and so important to business operations, I mean, of course, protecting data remains important, but the availability of the technology and making sure that things are up and running that we depend on and frankly take for granted, which is a whole different threat paradigm and a whole different risk paradigm when availability is the number one variable and not just confidentiality. And
Right.
it's definitely another interesting shift that I've seen.
Yep. And, one of the things I think through a lot is, when people ask me for advice in this arena, I always say, think about your fallback system, be war planning around a significant cyber attack on a third party or a direct cyber attack, and think about what are your fallback systems? How do you make sure that those mission critical services are available, you know, pretty quickly? We the whole conversation in this industry has shifted from prevention to resilience over the last few years, but many organizations have brought me in since the book came out to do cyber education, because really the value in the book is translating a lot of this into something that every lay person can understand.
Right.
I've been doing a lot of board education. When I talk about war planning and fallback systems, you'd be surprised how few companies have even engaged in sort of those basic game day scenarios.
Yeah, like anything else, practice makes perfect. You don't get good at something unless you practice it. And there's so many interesting decision points and dynamics. When do you communicate, when not to? All of that needs to be tabletop tested, et cetera, et cetera. So I absolutely agree with that. How do you think and fast forwarding a little bit to today, and maybe with some of the shifts that you talked about, how do you think the proliferation of these advanced 0 days and other some of the issues that we've been talking about, what do you think is the most significant change in the threat landscape for enterprises, say today versus when you wrote the book?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the main one is China. I'll start with the geopolitical piece of this. China, when I was so embedded in this threat, so immersed in it because they came for the New York Times. And when they came for the New York Times, I essentially kind of virtually embedded with our security team and was able to watch the PLA summer intern, roll into our networks at 9 a.m. being Shanghai time, actually, and roll out around 5. And, what they were doing was what they were doing everywhere at that point, which for the most part was just brazen phishing attacks, laterally crawling through the network, deploying the same kind of malware that we'd come to recognize, and some of the same backdoors we came to recognize, et cetera, et cetera. Now, they're showing up in these very severe, serious 0-day attacks, increasingly on critical pieces in the supply chain like Microsoft Exchange or Outlook. And the reason for that is because they underwent this massive reorganization where they moved a lot of, and in part based on our own naming and shaming and outing of these PLA units and hackers responsible for these attacks. Under Xi, they really reorganized their hacking operations and they pulled a lot of the responsibility for hacking away from these sort of sloppy, brazen, but effective PLA units to these sort of loose satellite networks of contractors that work at the behest of the Ministry of State Security. And, these are teams out there that are essentially front companies or shell companies or really elite hackers who have sophisticated day jobs but work for the MSS at night, who are able to develop custom malware, who are able to take the time to understand the topography of a system of interest to the PRC and find any way in that would not be obvious. And China banned the disclosure of 0 days. 2 years ago now, they created these new national security laws that said you have to give, as a Chinese citizen, the state right of first refusal on any 0 day you find. If you want to go to an international hacking competition, you have to apply to go through the Ministry of Public Security. If you want to engage in a hacking competition, you can engage in this one hacking competition that is sponsored by the Ministry of State Security. So they've taken all of those 0 days that would otherwise be sold or used by hobbyists or demonstrated on stage at Pwn to Own or for street cred, and they've brought them in-house and they're using them in these really sophisticated espionage campaigns. And they're showing up in Pulse VPNs, they're showing up in these attacks on Microsoft, they're showing up in these critical parts of the software supply chain. And it makes it really hard for enterprises to defend against these attacks. And in many cases, core to what Veza does, they're not hacking in anymore, they're logging in. And they're conducting living off the land attacks where they act just like a normal administrator, and you won't catch them until the day they're ready to sort of flick on whatever they have planned to detonate. So this is where we are. And, for the most part, these attacks are coming for enterprises because enterprises are what control our critical infrastructure, our healthcare systems, our water systems in a lot of cases, our grid, the software that makes its way into the grid, that makes its way into the pipelines. This is all an enterprise security issue now. And one of the things I've been out there beating the proverbial drum about is the fact that enterprises are the new frontline.
Right.
That's where we are. It was ridiculous when we first discovered this with Google. back in 2010 that, a private company is now expected to defend itself from an advanced nation state suite of Chinese military. And it's really ridiculous now.
Yeah.
But the fact is that you have to build out your security estate with this risk and threat in mind.
Yeah, it's come such a long way and it's changed so much. Let's explore a little bit. I'll call it just almost the shift in motivation, because I remember, being involved in security roundtables and rubbing shoulders with so many CISOs for so many years, that a lot of us were told and like briefed and educated on, for a while, the primary motivation for China, when you think about things like the China 2025 plan and some of their more targeted attacks against, say, healthcare, it was, and I know oversimplifying, but it was mainly around the acquisition of intellectual property to help build and grow China's capabilities,
Right.
basically just China for China. But now, since the motivation has shifted more toward disruption, or some of the motivations shifted more towards disruption and espionage, from a geopolitical perspective, what do you think is the trigger there, or is that something that's going to continue?
Mhm.
How would you describe that shift?
So I think they're still very much hacking our intellectual property. I think they've just gotten a lot better at it,
Mhm.
and a lot more strategic about it. And we saw with the Cloud Hopper campaign, they're coming in through MSPs, whereas before they were coming in through the front door. Kevin Mandia always used to call them the most polite hackers in cyber, because they'd almost announce themselves when they were there. And then when they underwent this massive reorg between sort of 2015 to 2019, when they reemerged, they were no longer the most polite hackers in cyberspace anymore. You didn't know they were there until it was too late.
Right.
And so, yes, the primary motivation initially was, let's make sure China's not just the world's manufacturing closet for cheap plastic toys and footwear. Let's make sure that we are innovators in our own right, wink, wink, even if it means we're innovating off of other people's stolen IP. And that is unfortunately still happening. But we never looked at China the way we looked at Russia or maybe Iran, which was they're looking to take us down on a dark, rainy day. And I think a couple things changed. I think one, Russia with its attacks in Ukraine, the Black Energy attacks, and then NotPetya, and then sort of really a lack of any kind of serious global international response to those cyber attacks. I think China saw that and they started thinking about their own sort of war planning, and the value of using a critical infrastructure attack to influence populations. I think they think about this as a deterrent effect. Sure, right now when we're not at war, the idea that we're going to let someone else go invade Taiwan,
Right.
take over Taiwan Semiconductor sounds like, oh, of course we would come to their defense, and we have a defense treaty with Taiwan. But what appetite will Americans have to go to war for a country some 7,000 miles away
Yeah.
when we can't get gas, or we can't get clean water, or our water's contaminated, God forbid, or name any other nightmare scenario. So I think that they started thinking about it in those terms. I think that it's the issue of Taiwan. When you look at Xi Jinping's speeches, is something that they see as manifest destiny.
Hmm.
Certainly, by their 100-year anniversary, which is coming in 2049, although in speeches they've cited 2027 as one possible deadline for reunification. And so you have to kind of look at what we're seeing here from these Volt Typhoon attacks with that geopolitical context.
Hmm.
And what they're doing is they are getting into our water systems. They're getting into some of our transportation systems. They're getting into some of our pipeline systems and utilities, basically targets with no intelligence gathering potential at all, no real IP
Right.
value at all. The only reason you would be there is to pre-position in case you wanted to turn something off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that's where they are. And when I've talked to people who've really tracked this threat and the sort of China experts, what they've said is, they might not be looking to shut everything down. I think the initial theory would be, let's delay military mobilization.
Right.
Let's and the best way to do that is to hack our satellites, essentially, and
Mhm.
satellite communications, because that's what our Navy uses to communicate with.
Right. It's
Um,
like Ghost Fleet.
right,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And then after that, I think it's this issue around how do we deter American support to
Right.
come to Taiwan's defense. And I think China's been watching closely as we've waffled on support for Ukraine,
Right.
and maybe Israel to a certain extent, and said, okay, well, we want an extra lever to
Yeah.
really add some urgency to any doubts that the American public might have about intervening here. And I think this is a great way to do it.
Yeah.
So what Andrew Scott, who's sort of the China lead at CISA, has called it is, the worst case scenario here is the everything everywhere all at once
Right.
cyber attack, where you think back to what happened with Colonial Pipeline
Hmm.
when people were panicking because they couldn't get gas for a few days. And, it was very serious. It wasn't just the gas and jet fuel, is the diesel
Right.
on that pipeline that was required to run our manufacturing and our economy that was at stake. And then you think about multiplying that against not just the biggest, pipeline for gas, jet fuel, and diesel on the Eastern Seaboard, but across the United States, and you pick a few selective targets. And now you're talking
Yeah.
about a very, very serious national security risk and a very key way to deter any kind of military mobilization at all. So I think that's where we are now. I hope we're not going to war with China anytime soon. That
Hmm.
would just be disaster, and truly terrifying. But I think based on what we are seeing, it gives you sort of the ability to read the tea leaves a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like if we had looked back on those twin attacks on the Ukraine grid by Russia in 2015, 2016, maybe the eventual invasion
Right.
in 2020 to 2023 would have seemed inevitable.
Hmm.
And I think at the very least, we need to start preparing
Yeah.
for that, both diplomatically, but also, on cybersecurity and this issue of fallback systems.
Yeah. You're right. Long-term cyber recon almost.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely an interesting pivot that's occurred, and so much linkage to the geopolitical landscape. It's just how it's all linking together is just staggering. Let's talk a little bit, and this has been great conversation. If we could shift a little bit to some of the impacts of some of these items too. You mentioned before about why hack in when you can log in. As obviously one of the things that we're focusing on here and what we talk about this podcast is the whole modernization and needed disruption for identity security and some of the those types of things. How would you link some of these shifts and focus areas to what needs to be done on the identity side and what some of the gaps are on the whole identity security space?
Well, I think this issue around they don't hack in, they log in anymore is a huge one.
Mm.
It's with COVID and the move to a hybrid workforce, it's been great. But it also means that the perimeter is gone.
Right.
Employees are the new perimeter, and we're a nightmare
Yeah.
because we all think of ourselves as our own CIO. We want to use whatever we want to use when we want to use it. And, essentially, those on the security team are just losing visibility left and right. And you know better than anyone, you can't secure what you don't even know is out there. So that has created this real conundrum.
Right.
And it means that it is really critical, not just have some sort of Okta solution for authentication and stop there. It means you need to know exactly who has data, and for what purpose,
Hmm.
and for how long they've had it. And it brings me back to Colonial Pipeline, actually. How did that start? it started like, how did someone, a bumbling group of cyber criminals, it wasn't even a nation state directed attack, a bumbling group of ransomware as a service
Right.
cyber criminals, how were they able to take out the biggest source of jet fuel and diesel and gas to the eastern seaboard? Well, they did it because Colonial Pipeline forgot to deprovision an employee. That employee's username and password were available on the dark web, and they didn't have a sufficient MFA solution in place,
Right.
and they didn't have confidence in sort of the air gap between their IT systems and their OT systems, and they couldn't capture billing information off the pipeline, so they just shut the whole thing down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that started with one guy that should have been deprovisioned,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah.
So, at the very least, the lowest hanging fruit here is know who still has access to what.
Yeah.
Have
Yeah.
confidence in what they do have access to and what they don't have access to, and that's just the baseline.
Right. I
Um,
agree. Yeah.
yeah, and then you wanna be mapping out workflows, and if suddenly I, Nicole Perlroth, who's never accessed anything, in the way of an earnings report in my life, starts trying to probe around and to access something, well, that means you have an insider risk
Oh,
situation
yeah.
on your hands.
Yep.
So you wanna be able to flag that and investigate that. So this is where we are,
Yeah.
and yeah, I'll stop there.
No, no, I agree with you completely. I mean, I think I would never say or argue that the stronger authentication capabilities that we built aren't important. They're absolutely important. But oftentimes I'm concerned about there's been so many eggs put in that basket, and then it's almost been a little bit of an overcorrection. We put so much focus on the authentication piece, we've forgotten to understand what actions people can actually take.
Yep, and I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
also, in too many cases, unfortunately, Okta, we've seen it, targeted.
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of these authentication solutions have been targeted, because many of their customers see them as, "Okay, once I have them, they don't have to worry about it once people are inside the building, or
Right.
the virtual building now,"
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's a losing game.
I agree. Just because they have a certain logo on their badge, we think they could be trusted. Um, this has been a great conversation, Nicole. I'm going to steer us to a little bit of a wrap up here based on all these discussions. And thank you so much for your insights and your time. Any closing advice or thoughts on maybe looking forward a little bit here on where you see things maybe going, or how we can prepare to deal with some of these things that are coming down the pike?
It's, it's like, well, where do you start?
Right.
Yeah, you start with the basics, right? And that is MFA, and you start there. Then you start thinking about, what does zero trust actually mean? It's become this completely nebulous, almost meaningless term in our industry. But it starts with this basic question of who has access to what. Do they still need it? Do they need it? Do they need it tomorrow?
Mhm.
And making sure people who don't have any reason to access data that they don't need to access never have access to it. And then on top of that, it's really this: what are my crown jewels? And I say that to, my mom, who's turning 80 this year, down to kids these
Right.
days. Like, my best piece of advice is just you. What is the one thing, if it's gone, game over for you,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
you're just gonna be devastated? And maybe for me, it's like, my photos of my kids when they're babies. Great, I'll back those up, and maybe I'll add an extra layer of protection around them. That's basically what enterprises need to do too.
Oh,
What
yeah.
are our crown jewels? Is it your IP? Is it, the availability of your services? And if you are undergoing some kind of major cybersecurity incident, is it, access to your customers? What is it? And once you've identified that, starting there and working your way backwards to figure out, how do I make sure that no one that needs access to that never gets access to it, or that if it's a critical function or service, it's available no matter what, and you have
Mhm.
those fallback systems in place, then focus there. But That's all you can do. Otherwise, this problem gets to be very, very overwhelming, and then we're all paralyzed.
No, you're right.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think, just starting with what are your crown jewels? And, unfortunately, now you have to think about AI
Mhm.
and, what are your employees handing over to these models? What's leaking out in terms of your own corporate secrets and special sauce? You have to think
Right.
about it on a whole new level of complexity, but it still is just this very basic idea of what are my crown jewels and how do I protect them at all costs?
Yeah. The only thing I'll add to that is it's something that we've been dealing with for a while in our personal lives. We go and check into that hotel in the Caribbean, and we haven't been out of the country for a while, so the fraud alert hits.
Right.
That's your point before about previous patterns being used to help understand this person who's only worked Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Why the heck are they downloading terabytes of data on the weekend? That's obviously got to be able to signal something.
Mhm.
Um, so well, thank you so much, Nicole. This has been great. I really, really appreciate your time. This has been awesome. And thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Yeah, always great to talk to you, Mike, and, yeah, good
Awesome.
time.
Well, thank you. That wraps up today's episode of Identity Radicals. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, in the world of identity, radical thinking leads to radical security. To see more Identity Radicals content, please subscribe to the Identity Radicals podcast on YouTube by scanning the QR code on the screen. Thank you and take care.